So today we're going to talk about medical device development, particularly looking at a Class 3 device. So I'm the Director of Regulatory Affairs, and so my department is primarily responsible for engaging with external health authorities. We get products registered on market. We're the ones who put together the pre-market applications. We work with colleagues around the globe to influence the way regulations are set. We do a lot of regulatory intelligence where we monitor the globe to see what's going on. So our job is really to be that resource to keep the company advised of where the regulations are changing and help get those products onto the market. And so with that, we're going to talk today about general medical device development. And we're going to we're going to touch on three major points: design controls for medical devices, clinical trials for a Class 3 device, and then the FDA approval process. All of these things that we do are really part of risk management. We're managing the risk of the device that we give to the patient, because the primary goal of the development process is the production of a safe and effective device. It has to be safe and not cause any harm to the patient or public health, and it has to be effective for the use in which it's intended. If you have a tongue depressor that can't depress a tongue, you don't really have a medical device. So that is really the goal of the entire development process, is that safe and effective device. And everything starts with design controls. So design controls are a set of principles and processes that we can follow to repeatedly and reproducibly develop a device so that we follow these processes. It's a faster, controlled development process, and it helps us get products to the market faster. So this diagram shows the general idea behind the design controls. You start with the user needs, you move through design inputs, the iterative design process. Your design output finally leads to your medical device. You verify and validate. And all of this, of course, reviews at every step of the process. Good design and development of any project starts with planning. A good plan incorporates everything you're going to do to make your device from I have an idea to I'm putting my product on the market. So you're going to focus on what kind of product are you making? What's its intended use? The users, the environment. What countries are you going to sell the device in? Because that's going to change your regulatory strategy. How are you going to verify and validate the device is safe and effective? The higher the risk of the device, the more robust and intense your verification and validation activities. So your plan really helps set all of this out at the beginning of the project. And now you can come back and refer to it throughout the project. And it's a living document. As your project grows and changes, update your plan. So this really becomes the repository of what have I done and what do I still have to do. And remember, again, these are living documents. I highly recommend you update throughout the process. Once you've written your plan, it's time to start looking at your design inputs. Your design inputs are, what kind of device am I going to build? You specify the requirements that will address the user and patient stakeholder needs. And the best place to get your design inputs is the customer. What do they need and how will they use that device? You can think you're the best laid device, but then you give it to the customer and turns out they don't like the orientation. So they always use it different than you intended. So that's one of those design inputs. Talk to your customers. Usability, particularly in an implantable medical device, such as a total artificial heart, is very important. What are those risks of your customer using your device? So those really go into your design inputs. What do I need to build? And risk management, again, plays a big part of this. As you develop your customer requirements, what does the customer actually need? You can then break that down into what are the risks from the device that I'm intending to build for the customer. And that really falls into your first use failure mode effects analysis. The neat part about this is the controls you need to mitigate the risks from your customer requirements become the first inputs into your product requirements. So your first input to your product requirements, how am I going to design this device to mitigate those risks I found in my customer requirements? You can then break your product requirements down in your design failure mode and effects analysis document. And those risks then become mitigated, and the mitigations in your design FMEA then become the inputs into your technical specifications. How do I have to build this device to mitigate the risks I found in the design. Technical specifications are then reviewed in the process FMEA, and the process repeats itself. So it always goes back to risk. What are my risks and how am I going to control it? The next part of the process is the design outputs, right? And these are the tangible outputs. These are your spec documents, your manufacturing instructions, your labeling, right? This is all of those final elements. And they come together here at this phase to show that you actually have a viable product. One thing I forgot to mention is at all steps in this process is document. Everything you do has to be documented. If it's not documented, it didn't happen. So document your inputs, document your design outputs, you document your requirements, your planning. If you have to deviate, if you change your plan, make sure you document these things because that becomes part of the history of the design of your device. And no, I've never worked on a design project that has started at A and mapped a course to C, and we've gotten there by going through B. There's always some new wrinkle that comes in, and that's captured in your plan and in your documentation, and that becomes part of that history. So make sure to remember, good documentation is important. Does anybody have any questions? Please feel free to stop me at any point as we're moving along here. So once you've gone through the design input and output process and you think you have your design, now it's time to demonstrate that you actually built the thing you tried to design. That's where you get to design verification. Do your design outputs match your design inputs every time? So that means if I design a driver that it needs to sustain 120 beats per minute, the battery has to last 6 hours and it has to be in an environment where it can be up to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 40, 45 degrees Celsius. This is where your design verification comes in. You go and you put your heart on the mock tank, you connect your driver, and you run it. Can my driver with that battery sustain 120 beats a minute for 6 hours in a hot environment? That's really your design verification. You look at your product requirements, those things that you were designing, and you make sure that you actually met them. This is likely going to be done with some kind of laboratory testing, benchtop testing. For an artificial heart, a lot of reliability testing in this phase. Can our drivers run? Can our heart pump for 100 days, 200 days? Can our heart continuously pump for a year or 2 years? These are the types of activities that you do during the verification that demonstrates the device you have is the device you intended to build. Whether or not it meets the customer needs or not, this is the phase to demonstrate my design equals my inputs. The next phase of the process is design validation. Did I build what the customer actually needs? This is where we go back to our customer requirements and we validate that we've actually met them with our design. The customer requirement might be something like it's fully implantable. The driver works in a backpack, right? These are higher level requirements on what a customer needs, where the customer is going to use it, and how they're going to use it, right? This is where we get into things like your clinical study, where we potentially have to put the heart in patients and monitor their progress in an active clinical study. Maybe this is where we do usability studies, right? Where we give the patient the device and let them use it in a controlled environment with controlled expectations. Excuse me. So this is the part where we demonstrate that this device is suitable for its intended use in intended use environment for that intended use patient population. Right, this is where we demonstrate we actually have in a medical device. With that is process validation. This is where you demonstrate that you can repeatably and reproducibly manufacture the device that is safe and effective coming off the manufacturing line. So there are two different phases of your overall validation. Design validation, where you demonstrate that you've met your customer requirements, and then the process validation, which demonstrates that your manufacturing line can repeatably and reproducibly build this device. This phrase, repeatably and reproducibly, is very important. So you'll see that come up again and again. if you run it 10 times and you can only get a good safe device 7 times, is that an efficient manufacturing process, right? So that's why that repeatable is important and reproducible, right? If I do the device 10 times, I need to know it's going to give me the same results or the same performance 10 times. So that's why the manufacturing process validation is so important. Okay, so the next step in the process is the design transfer. I have a medical device. I'm sure I can build it. I'm sure it works and it functions. So now I pass this off to my manufacturing team. This is where I hand them their manufacturing instructions, their work instructions, the actual pieces of how they're going to build this device. That includes labeling as well, which needs to go into the device, right? What are those boxes, the packaging, the wrappers? What is all that going to look like? All of that is passed off from the design team to the manufacturing team in a formal fashion during this design transfer phase. And it's very important that you have good communication throughout the design process, but particularly here in the transfer process, it's very easy for things to get missed and get lost. And I say that from personal experience. It's always good to have a manufacturing rep on the team when you're developing a device to keep an eye on passing that off. It's just because it works in a lab and when you're making 15 and 20 doesn't mean you can scale up to 100 or 1,000. So that's where that design transfer and design process validation really comes into play. Because at the end of the day, right, as much fun as a development process is, the goal is to design and develop a medical device that we can market and sell. And so we have to be able to manufacture that in an economical and cost-effective fashion. Now, before we go on, there's one thing we haven't talked about yet is the concept of the design review and a review session after every one of these phases. And then the review session is really to challenge the team. Have I accomplished my goals of that phase? And we're in the design input phase. Did I properly lay out all of the necessary inputs that are going to be necessary to build my design and my device? You will always have an independent reviewer whose job it is to challenge. And that's a lot of fun. I like being the challenger. At the design output phase, did you really build your device? Does it have all the necessary features? When reviewing your verification and validation data, does it really show what you say it shows, right? Can you really support the safe and effective use of that device? So it's not just a paperwork exercise when you go through those design reviews, right? It's really the team's chance to ensure that they have gotten things right. And sometimes you don't pass the design review, and sometimes you have to go back and do a little bit of more work. But it's better to find that out now where it's cheaper and easier to fix than down the line. So when you're working through your design process, remember the importance of a design review. Now, design changes. As you're working through your initial design, you're going to find things don't work and you have to make a design change. Once you've gotten your product onto the market, you're going to want to make design changes to fix identified flaws, fix bugs, make the device a safer product, add new features. So that really requires a systematic approach, right? Much like an initial design when you're doing it, right? It starts with a plan. What do I want to do in this design change? I need to fix this, add this feature, remove this bug. Okay, great. What requirements are my changing? That's my design inputs. Okay, go through my design phase. Was I able to remove that bug? Did I add that safety feature? Did I add that bell and whistle? Because again, right, it all comes back to doing things in a systematic way. And the system works, right? If you follow the design control system, you'll know you'll get a good output if you have good inputs. Bad inputs get bad outputs. So that's why, again, always follow the process. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to paperwork because paperwork is what rules. And paperwork is just as much a part of the product as the device itself. Because the paperwork is what we then turn around and use to support the product, get the product on market, and keep the product on market through the long term. So in the US, that's known as your device history file, your DHF. And it really is a record of your device plan, your design inputs, your outputs, all your verification and validation. It records your design transfer. It's your bill of materials, your device master record. All of those things necessary for this device lives in that design history file. And it really becomes a one-stop shop for reviewers and regulators to look through your product and make sure, okay, I can support this as safe and effective. All right. Great. Any questions on design controls?
I guess a question I quickly had, you highlighted how documentation is key, obviously. Are there standard templates for each kind of stage of the design process to like structure your documentation that would be easier to hand off to someone or get it checked off for clinical trials and stuff like that?
Great question. So um, nothing says you have to do your paperwork in a certain way, but the FDA does provide guidance on what they expect to see in certain kinds of documents. And so, or the in the EU, right, the ISO standards give you guidance on what should be in these types of documents. And so when you sit down to build your plan or your requirements document, you can use these guidance documents to say, okay, I know I must make sure I meet these 7 things, and so then you can build that into your templates. There are a number of companies out there that sell prepackaged things where you can go and buy off the shelf templates. In general, I mean, you can't necessarily go to the FDA and download, say, a requirements template, but they will tell you what's expected. And there are there are industry groups that also kind of help standardize some of that. So if you're in the industry for a while, right, you can go to company and you'll see variations, but most requirements documents look similar. What's the requirement? What's the source? What's its level of risk? So no, they're not necessarily standardized templates, but after a while, right, the industry sort of standardizes it. So moving from company to company, it's not a culture shock necessarily. Does that
Okay.
answer your question?
Yes. Yeah. The
Good.
the other one was this, as you're saying, design validation versus manufacturing validation. I
Sure.
imagine this can be a potential roadblock because, as you said, something that can be made in small numbers may not be easily to be mass produced. How, like, does one consider that from the beginning, or is it something that you would look at more later on once you know you've made something that does meet the design requirements at least?
No, and that's a fantastic question, right? And that comes back to a concept called designing for manufacturability, right? Is keeping your one of your intended targets of your design is your manufacturing team. That's why I say it's always good to have a manufacturing representative as part of your design concept. Um, while you're working through the process, right? Let's say you're working at a company that makes a lot of IVDs, right? They just pump out different tests, right? It's not hard to realize the manufacturing from one IVD to the next inside a company, right? The juice might change a little bit, but the manufacturing processes are not going to change. So it's fairly easy in that case to anticipate the scale up needs. Let's say you're working on a niche product like the heart. A large part of the development process initially is going to be how do I build this? And then you have to go through that process validation to figure out you can actually build it and build it reproducibly. So it takes a little bit of trial and error to get that right. And then you also need to then plan that into your testing. Do I want to commit $10 million in 2 years to a clinical trial if I'm not sure I can actually manufacture this device to scale? So when do you do that process validation? Do I make sure I can build it to scale before I start a 2 year, $10 million clinical study? Is it something I do in parallel? So these are some of the decisions that have to be weighed as part of that initial team. And that's why that design plan is so important, because that's one of the elements is what is my manufacturing going to look like? Am I going to have to make 1 million units of an IVD? Am I making 100,000 knee braces, 10,000 artificial knees, 200 artificial hearts, right? So your marketing team would also have to be involved in that early on to kind of tell you, well, I initially plan to only target these markets, so our initial sales forecast is this number per year. So these are the kind of decisions that and inputs that go into the design. So it ties all of that together. Your design team is not just your engineers and your scientists and your medical staff, right? Any good design team will have your regulators, your quality. You'll have a marketing and a business rep. You'll have your manufacturing team member, because all of these functions provide those inputs into making this device. Because just because you have the world's most perfect device, if I can't sell it, I'm not helping those patients. So all of these things become part of those design inputs.
Amazing. Thank you very much.
It's a complicated process when you initially look at it, but that's the advantage of design controls as laid out by 21 CFR Part 820 in the United States and ISO 1345 globally. It provides those steps and it gives you those prompts and nudges so that if you set your processes up, once you've gone through that process, you do it again, you're going to do the exact same things at the exact same steps. It becomes second nature and you start anticipating some of these needs, which is the advantage of doing these things systemically or systematically. Great. Any more questions? All right. Yeah, again, feel free to stop me if you do have any questions. And now we'll move into the next phase, right? Because this is the important, right? Clinical trials for class 3 products. What's the point of the clinical trial, right? What's the point of the overall development process? It is ensuring a safe and effective product. Goes back to that concept of risk management, right? Risk management is about ensuring a safe and effective product. So really, everything we do as a medical device company is part of our risk management process, right? We're managing the risk, minimizing the risk that we as a manufacturer give to the patient when they accept our device and start using it. No device is without risk. So there's always going to be some risk given to the patient. And so this is part of what the development process is identifying what are those risks. A large part of your verification and validation process is demonstrating that the identified risks have been controlled to an acceptable level. But there's certain things you can't learn and control just by doing performance testing or mock testing or bench testing. You sometimes have to do a clinical trial in human population. And that comes with a lot of risk. And these patients accept a lot of that risk. So it's very important that we do this in such a fashion that we minimize the risk to the patient and maximize the information that we're going to get back from the clinical trial. And so we're going to focus today on class 3 clinical trials for the US focus primarily. And again, the purpose of that clinical trial is the determination of the safety and efficacy of the device. Right. Excuse me. And so some of the things we're going to look at when we're determining safety and effectiveness is who's going to use the device as intended. Where's the device going to be used? Under what conditions? What kind of labeling are we going to provide? Because that's important. What is the potential benefit against the potential injury, right? The benefit risk assessment. And how reliable is the device? So these are some of the questions we're looking at answering when we're looking at safety and effectiveness. So what exactly do we mean when we say safety? And again, it's a reasonable assurance that the device is safe. Excuse me, when used for its intended purpose with intended audience in its intended use environment. And that the benefits of the device outweigh any remaining risk. This can really be established through things like animal studies, human subjects, right? The clinical trial, and in some cases in vitro studies if you have less risk device. And then effectiveness. What's effectiveness? Excuse me. Excuse me. It is, you're right, reasonable assurance the device is effective when used. Excuse me. Basically, your intended target audience can use it as intended, right? If I say the patient can go home with this driver and run it on a battery for 6 hours, the effectiveness study shows, yes, that patient can take it home and run it for 6 hours. So really, those are the two main pillars of the clinical study. Can the patient use the device and to its intended medical benefit, and can the patient use the device as intended effectively and safely? And these are going to be established using the concept of valid scientific evidence. When you make your submission to the FDA, you can use any data sources you want to demonstrate the safety and effectiveness. The FDA then can decide whether or not the evidence you provided is considered valid scientific evidence for the determination of the safe and effective use of your device. So you can provide them studies with sample sizes of 2, journal articles from Google, and some testimony from your cousin, and it might make the device look really good. The FDA does not have to accept that. They can push back and say this is not valid scientific evidence. So you really want to make sure your evidence comes from well-controlled investigations, partially controlled studies, less weight with the FDA, but they'll still carry. Studies and objective trials without controls, right? Case studies from qualified experts, real world evidence is a big thing, right? How is your device performing in the actual world? So these are some of the things that the FDA considers valid scientific evidence as part of their assessment of your device. So what you really want to do when you're providing, you're building a clinical study for a class 3 device, a high-risk device, is you really want a well-controlled clinical investigation. And this is, again, it goes back to that systematic approach. There are ISO standards that dictate how you set up and run a clinical trial. The FDA in the Code of Federal Regulations has specific clinical trial guidance and expectations. But again, right, it all boils back to what is the objective of your study? What are you trying to prove? How do you pick your subjects? Methods of observation and recording. What are you recording? How are you recording it? Where is it going to be documented? How are you minimizing bias? Comparison of the results, right? Control versus non-control, and a summary of and then your statistical analysis plan. I collect all my data. How am I going to analyze it? And then you, excuse me, and this forms the basis of your overall clinical plan, which turns into your clinical protocol. And the key, right, is getting your clinical data and getting data that you can analyze. When you're putting together your PMA, right, you're going to be drawing conclusions from the data and the data analysis that your company did. And so you draw them and put them out there. Let the FDA review that data. But make sure that the data supports the conclusions that you want. And it always comes back to, excuse me, I'm choking myself. It always comes back to, right, can I demonstrate the safe and effective use of the device that the benefits outweigh the risk? And so, yeah, here is just, again, like, this is sort of what the data summary looks like from a PMA, right? This is what you're looking for in terms of that clinical study. Give me the results, right? That's what they want to see, number one. What's the data? Show it to me. Give me all the bulk data. I'm not going to look at it, but I want you to summarize it. Put it in graphs and charts. Tell me what it means. Make sure I understand who is included, who is excluded, and why. What are those exclusion criteria? What are your inclusion criteria? Why did people drop out? Anticipated and unanticipated adverse events, right? I know going in, I've got a 1% chance that my machine is going to just turn itself off. We got to make sure we're watching those patients. Do I see that potential 1%? Was it higher? Was it lower? What didn't I expect, right? Because that's always the fun part, is the unexpected things that come out of the development process. Any deviations, right? Sometimes when you're executing studies, you can't execute to the plan. Situations change. So why did you deviate? What did you deviate to? Missing data, right? Maybe you're relying on doctors to input data and send it to you. Maybe they didn't get a weight on a patient. They didn't get a demographic. They missed something. That's going to happen. Maybe you contacted the CRO and they forgot something, right? okay, shoot, I don't have these pieces of data. How is this going to affect my impact my study? Does missing one weight, two genders, and a few nationalities, does that change the outcome of my actual data and make my outcomes unreliable? Always comes back to your statistical analysis plan. The FDA and other health agencies always want to know, how did you analyze your data? What statistical tools did you use? What were the assumptions? Were those assumptions good? Are those assumptions based on precedent? That's a big thing with the FDA, right? If you did it this way before, do it that way again, and you can lean on that. Yeah, comparison the results to success failure criteria. Was your study successful? You can learn a lot in a failed study, right? That tells you a lot of information that you can turn around and reuse. And again, right, conclusions. And how do those conclusions relate back to how you intend that device to be used, right? Does your data support your intended use? My intended use is a bridge to transplant for cardiac patients, them at risk of death. Does my clinical data support I can keep patients alive while they're waiting for a transplant? Yes or no, right? So at the end of the day, boil your hypothesis down to a simple statement to yourself, and can you prove that with the data you have? If you can't, then you need to go back and redo your study, and hopefully right at the end you've gotten successful data that shows that you can meet your indication. Any questions before we go on to the approval process? I know there's a lot in there to digest. All right. So the FDA uses a risk-based identification, as do most health authorities throughout the world. In the US, it's class 1, 2, and 3, class 1 being the lowest level of concern, class 3 being the highest level of concern. And just because you start out as a class 3 doesn't mean you can't demonstrate the safe and effective use of devices get lowered to a class 2. That can happen with the right data. But mostly when you start on a new medical device project, you know what you're developing, and so you have a good idea of what the classification is. And there's definitely lots of guidance out there to help you choose. And here are the 5 major types of submissions to the FDA. Type submissions, right? Your class 1, it's mostly exempt from pre-market from pre-market submissions and pose little risk to the patient or public health. You have your pre-market notifications. It's known as a 510K. This is for your class 2. These use what's called special controls by the FDA. Then you have your pre-market application. That's your PMA. That's for your class 3 for your life supporting and life sustaining. You have a de novo type, and this is for something that is a new device, something that's not been marketed in the US. And its safety and effectiveness profile is not well understood. This would be coming out with something like, well, I'm trying to think of a good example off the top of my head. I don't know, maybe like a new kidney, right? Or an artificial liver. We've never had one before. It's hard to decide, well, maybe not artificial kidney, right? Those will be class 3, but it's a device where it's new to the market and you don't necessarily know how to classify it yet because that product type safety profile hasn't been demonstrated. And then you have humanitarian device exemptions, and these are for products that have not been approved for regular use, but are intended to treat a niche illness or market space that is currently not being supported. There are certain restrictions on it, right, on how many you can sell a year. But these are the main types. Of course, being a life-sustaining device, we fall under the class 3. So class 1 devices, these are your basic low-risk devices, and they're governed by what the FDA considers general controls. These are things like good manufacturing processes. GMP is well established throughout the industry. There are books and classes you can take on good manufacturing processes. Follow them, right? Anytime there's an adverse event or a malfunction that could lead to an adverse event, you're required to report that to the FDA. registration, right? You must register your company. So every medical device manufacturer is registered with the FDA, and basic quality management system and record keeping. These are basic general controls for any medical device, and these are the ones that specifically apply to Class 1 devices. Class 2 devices follow general controls with special controls, right? These are more risky devices. So they therefore are then required to comply with additional requirements to demonstrate the safe and effective use. There are more labeling requirements on the device, what can and cannot put on the label. There are performance standards that must be met, right? You have to meet certain thresholds to demonstrate your device is safe. Testing requirements, EMC testing, electricals testing, things that demonstrate that since your device is a higher risk, maybe there's electrical components, a battery, specific testing to demonstrate that those subcomponents are also safe, as well as the general controls. And then you get to Class 3. Class 3 devices are, of course, dictated by general controls, but they also fall under the pre-market approval process. So there's a much higher bar in terms of evidence necessary to support a Class 3 device. There are higher testing standards, performance requirements, the level of data necessary to support PMA is greater. I would say a typical 510K submission to the FDA in terms of sheet count, probably 25 to 50,000 sheets of paper, you know. A PMA, I've seen PMAs that have well over 250,000 sheets of paper, just in terms of in the old school when they actually submitted by paper. So an example of what we're talking about in terms of the data requirements from a Class 2 to a Class 3 device. So that's a nice little visual idea of the level of data required for a Class 3. So there are 3 main review processes for the medical devices. Class 1 are listed. When you have developed and designed and developed your device, you've demonstrated it's safe and effective, it's a Class 1 device, you notify the FDA that you're putting the product on market, they add it to the list of your registration, and you immediately goes on to the market. You don't have to wait for FDA approval. When the FDA comes as part of their annual inspections and things, they will look at your Class 1 devices to make sure that they are compliant. Class 2, your pre-market notification, right? This allows the device to be called, excuse me, in the pre-market approval, or the pre-market notification or 510K process, you're basically demonstrating that my device is as substantially equivalent, is as safe or better than a device that's already on the market. Let's say I'm looking at a blood test for a disease marker, right? There's already one on the market. My job then is to demonstrate that I can detect as well or better than the on-market product that disease marker, right? My breathing machine provides as good or better breathing performance than the competitor's device. So in that Class 2 510K space, you're really doing a substantial equivalence demonstration. You don't have to necessarily demonstrate the novel functionality, just that this is at least as safe and effective as what's on the market. And in the pre-market approval process, that Class 3, you're not comparing it against a competitor. You're demonstrating that this device meets its intended purpose, and this is where you really start getting into clinical trials, right? You don't necessarily need to do a large-scale clinical trial to demonstrate the equivalence of a Class 2, but for Class 3s, you have to get out there and demonstrate in a patient, in its use environment, it is going to meet those goals. And so that's really the much bigger hurdle that comes with those Class 3 devices. Does that make sense? And the big question, right, is all of this is well and good. Oh, wait, one more thing. So for Class 3 medical devices, particularly new devices or devices with public health risks, the FDA can choose to go to the advisory committee. And the advisory committee is made up of internal and external experts. They sit on a panel, they review your data, you can argue to the panel, and the panel then makes a recommendation on whether or not they think your device is safe. This is an extra layer of assurance, right? Getting experts in the room and letting them decide. The FDA is not required to abide by the advisory panel's decision, but they typically do. And again, right, this would be for the highest risk class 3 devices typically. But yes, so then all of that comes to how long does it take to actually develop a class 3 medical device? If we look here in the early phase, right, this is where we go, I have found an area where I have some talent and expertise and I can build a device. Through all, right, build your business case, your requirements, proof of concept, right, your feasibility. Can I actually build this device through the preclinical testing? You're looking at anywhere up to 60 months and $20 million. Moving into that clinical phase, right? This is where we actually go and do clinical trials in the clinical work. Again, right? There's sources for where a lot of these numbers come from, but again, you're looking for 70, 79, almost 80 months and $32 million. And then moving into the commercial phase, just getting the device on market, going through a PMA approval process, that takes typically over a year to a year and a half. The fee is somewhere over $300,000 just for the FDA. Then there's getting a reimbursement so that you can market the company and get paid back. So a lot of time and money goes into building a medical device, right? And down here, right, chances of approval, right? 14% chance of approval in your non-clinical phase. So in other words, what, 86% of devices don't make it out of this phase. Once you get into clinical trial, right, early feasibility studies, safety studies, only about 29% of those devices even make it out of early feasibility studies, with 60% getting to a successful pivotal study making it. Then once you get through your clinical studies, there's still a 20% chance that you don't make it through the FDA approval process. So this is not to scare you. This is really to show you how difficult, time consuming, and expensive it is. Over here, summarize it, right? 13 years from inception to approval of a lot of these high risk class 3 medical devices. Typically $54 million. Yeah, $54 million development fee for one medical device. Now, if you factor in failed clinical studies, the cost for that successful device quickly goes over $200 million. So a lot of money is needed to get through the development process. A lot of time, but again, right, that's the fun. All right. Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, question I had was, I guess, twofold. One was in the PMA, it mentions like when you're submitting that, you're to include all the data from all the trials that you've done. And I would assume throughout the testing, there would have been potentially failed trials. Would that be then you'd show that data and then have to explain what was changed in the device and things to modify, or would it be considered a new device and you wouldn't do them report them trials?
Sure. All clinical trials are publicly available knowledge. So you can't, to start the clinical trial, you get FDA approval. You get approval to use your device as an investigational device. So the FDA is aware of the trial going on. They review the trial protocol. You have an internal review board that also supports you at your clinical sites. So every failed trial becomes public knowledge. So that will become part of your submission and you learn from that, right? Why did this trial fail? If it's a failure due to the target or the population or a performance indicator, you can tweak it and re-execute the study. And you just come back and say, I've made these design modifications, I've changed these studies, and you come back and then you apply to do another clinical study.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. The other was highlighting the sheer size of the amount of data. Like, then how long does it take for the FDA to be able to review such quantities of data?
I don't have fresh statistics now, but typically a PMA submission takes somewhere from, I would say, 11 to 16 months. So you're typically looking at a year of review. The more complex the data is, the more the FDA has questions on the submission, the longer it will take. When they come back with significant deficiencies and questions, their review clock stops, right? So you could be answering questions for months and not on their official review clock time, based on feedback that they get from the device. So the more complex it is, of course, the longer it's going to take, the more questions they have. Um, if you work with your regulators earlier on, have pre-submission meetings, you can help prepare them, and so that can lower some of the time. Um, for some complex devices, there are modular PMAs, so you can submit modules of the PMA over time, and they get reviewed individually. So that can help speed things up, right? So you can have your performance data, your manufacturing site, your quality system being reviewed during the clinical trials. So when that data comes in, the FDA is then just looking at that data. So there are ways to minimize the review time, but typically you're looking, I would say I would plan for at least a year.
Mm-hmm. And is it because as you said, through these trials, you're applying for approvals anyway as investigational studies. So like the FDA is aware, is it the same broad group of people that are like kind of seeing through the regulatory approval, if you get what I'm saying? Because I
I get
know
what
like
you're saying.
even before trials, you can have like meetups with the FDA to clarify things as well.
So,
Yeah.
but sure. Reviewers will be assigned to the project, and so they typically do try to see them through. It's more efficient for the agency to have the same set of eyes throughout and trying to get people caught up. So typically that is sort of the goal. But like with any organization, priorities, projects, and resourcing demands can change. So particularly from a over a long time period, some of these clinical trial things can drag on for 5 and 6 years. People come and go, things change. But you the agency is pretty good at maintaining that kind of continuity. Typically, that's not the biggest bottleneck I have found.
Okay.
It's a good question, though.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Please.
Oh, yeah, I will just put the Google public calendar that I mentioned earlier in the chat as well. But feel free to raise your hand, use the chat function or the Q&A.
While you're thinking about it, one of the characteristics of a good regulatory affairs professional is technical competence. Typically, people in this role have a strong scientific background. You'll see a lot of people with PhDs. You'll occasionally get people with law degrees, although typically it's that technical background is very useful. Um, while we are not the technical experts on a project, we do talk technical with the agencies. So having that strong background is very helpful. Um, but also being an effective communicator, being able to write clearly, being able to talk clearly and concisely, um, and working cross functionally, because that's another big thing, right? we're part of the project team, and our goal is to streamline the development process and provide that good guidance so that when the development team has wrapped up and done and they're ready to pass off that data package to regulatory, we can pick that up and quickly turn that into the submission, right? We're not spending a lot of time having to go back and forth, asking a lot of questions. So um, being on the regulatory affairs side is you are actively involved in the technical development, and that makes it a very fun and challenging and rewarding experience. And being the one that gets to guide that development process and provide the input on uh, test setup, acceptance criteria, sample size, how we do our statistical analysis plan. Regulatory is very much involved in all of those discussions and get to act as a conduit between our technical expertise and the expertise at the regulatory agency. So um, it's a great career choice for those who have that technical background to consider it. So you're not just being in a lab when you have a technical degree.
Yes, that's definitely important to highlight. I know from my university, Melbourne University, that several of the biomedical engineering graduates have gone on to become regulatory specialists, even patent kind of attorneys, both in the approval of patents or for a company to submit patents as well, because that technical knowledge is essential to be able to just interpret and communicate this all anyway.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And then being able to read regulations. They're not written for a lay audience, and they're not written to be entertaining. So sometimes you have to dig through it and figure out what they mean. And so then just being able to good reading comprehension is another important skill. Okay. No questions?
I
Seems
have
to be.
one.
Oh, please.
Yes. Hi. First off, a really great talk. It's really great. Even though I live in this every day, it's still really great to see a comprehensive timeline summary of what we do on a daily basis and what we try to accomplish. My question for you is, knowing that the pathway to getting into a career in regulatory affairs isn't always direct and clear cut compared to pre-med tracks or other professional school tracks, what expert advice would you give to someone who wants to get the ball rolling on pursuing a career as a regulatory affairs professional?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, definitely. It starts with getting a science or engineering degree, right? Get a STEM degree. If there are now a number of schools that do graduate programs in regulatory sciences, USC has a good one, Northeastern has a really good one, as well as a number of other ones. Purdue has a fantastic program. That's where I went through it. So you can go directly into that as a graduate program, as a master's degree or a PhD, or you go into business, right? Get a job in the industry, be the scientist or junior scientist on that team, learn the development process and the technology, and then work with your regulator. Be that liaison between the regulatory team and your development team. And then when those opportunities present themselves, go for it, right? Particularly at the specialist level, so often those are people who are brought in from engineering or medical or some other scientific or technical discipline. Um, I can train you on the regs or I can train you on the technology. I don't want to train you on both, right? So, as a hiring manager, that's what I'm looking for. Come in with that technical background, show me that you have an understanding of the regulations, and then we will teach you how to interpret and apply them, and guide you on that career path. So, if it's something you find interesting, right, find a mentor or an advisor in the regulatory team and start working with them. Most companies love cross training and seeding that kind of information in different teams. So even if you don't end up getting one of those roles, they'll still work with you to help you build that skill and background so that over time you definitely become a viable candidate.
Thank you.
Thanks.
It's on the hour, so thank you, Aaron, for your amazing presentation,
Well, thank you.
giving the overview and highlighting the important career of as a regulatory specialist that these competing teams can pursue as well.
Definitely, yeah. When I was an undergraduate in chemistry, quality and regulatory affairs was not something that was really talked about as career options. It was bench chemistry, teaching, or going to graduate school. And I think now you're starting to see more of that, and I think that's really important to know that there are options for STEM degrees that aren't just being bench chemists or engineers. Not just, but doing those. There are other things you can do with that technical background to help support patients.
Exactly.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate your time and your questions today. I think the work you're doing is fantastic and it's so exciting. We love following along here at Syncardia. Yeah, I wish you all the best of luck in the future.
Great.
And if there's anything we can do, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to Ethan and he can forward them to us through Duffy, and we can definitely answer them for you.